second night of what Ukraine describes as hellish aerial assaults by Russia on the city of Odesa, home to Ukraine's primary grain shipment port in the Black Sea. The drone and missile strikes caused extensive damage to critical port infrastructure. The strikes come after Russia pulled out of a year-old deal to allow the export of grain from Ukraine. Russia now also says it will consider all ships heading to Ukraine as legitimate military targets. Meanwhile, Ukraine's counteroffensive enters a second month, and officials concede that it's going slower than expected. But some progress has been made. The biggest territorial gains for Ukraine have been near Velyka Novosilk, southwest of Donetsk, where Ukrainian forces have been able to liberate 4 villages. DW Special Correspondent Aya Ibrahim was one of the few reporters given access to the area where she found out firsthand why people are reluctant to return.
This village is one of the first Ukraine has taken back from Russia in its counteroffensive. It's called Neskuchne, which means not boring in Ukrainian. Today that feels like a cruel joke. Neskuchne used to be home to about 700 people. Now there's nothing for them to come back to.
It pains me to see this, because there used to be life here. Sometimes it hurts even to see the land. The land is constantly being torn apart by shelling. Nature suffers, people suffer, the country suffers. Everything that is alive suffers. Everything suffers.
As we're filming, we experience why no one's coming back. As Russian troops retreated, they mined the whole village.
Finish. We're going.
We have to move fast. The Russians are constantly firing. What I was about to say was that the Russians mined the whole village, as well as their positions on the front lines. This strategy means every step of territory Ukrainian troops regain is paid for with blood. This nearby military medical point deals with the consequences. Doctors here stabilize casualties so they can be moved to a hospital.
We've been seeing injuries related to mine explosions, which lead to amputations. When a mine-injured person is brought to us, we hear them before we see them. Even while they're being carried from the car, we can already hear them because of how loud they scream.
It's a fate these men are determined to avoid. They've just returned from ambushing Russian positions. Everyone's exhausted, but there's no time to rest. They're carrying out exercises to learn from what they've seen on the battlefield. It won't be enough on its own, though. They tell me they need Ukraine's allies to step up more.
We need everything. Artillery, shells, planes, and equipment. We're lacking everything. You have to look at it that way. This isn't some kind of game. These are still human lives.
I ask Anton about criticism that Ukraine's counteroffensive is slow.
Let them show us how it should be done. The problem with these politicians and SOFA experts is that they're all talk. The Russians are on the defensive. They shouldn't be underestimated. Fighting them isn't easy. I wouldn't say we're slow. We're actually making good progress. If people say we can go faster, it's just empty words, like when the Russians said they could take Kiev in 3 days.
This is the town of Velyka Novosilk. The Russians never got this far, but we're just a 5-minute drive from Neskuchne, the village that was occupied. Here, a successful counteroffensive can't come fast enough. This time of year, this place would normally be bustling with life, families and people just enjoying the sunny day. But now there's just absolutely nothing left. There's barely a building intact. The sound of artillery here is just relentless. It just does not stop. Velyka Novosilk is one of the closest towns to the front lines, with civilians still living in it. It had a pre-war population of about 7,000. Now, locals tell me there are just a few hundred left. Tatiana is one of them.
Ну что вам сказать? Здесь я родилась.
I was born here. This is where my story began. How can I live? All my ancestors are buried here.
Здесь мои все предки. Почему мы отдали?
Why should we give up Ukrainian land? Just because they are stronger? We are stronger in spirit.
As we speak, sounds of artillery. Tatiana doesn't even flinch.
Приспособились уже как-то.
We have already adapted somehow, like there is some kind of mutation in our bodies. We don't react to explosions like that anymore.
Реагируешь на взрывы, на все эти.
We have to survive somehow.
А как-то нужно ж выживать.
There's no electricity here, no running water, no heating, and no shops. This volunteer who brings food in twice a month is a crucial lifeline.
My husband is now defending our country on the front line, and I'm defending the humanitarian front. Some here have nowhere to go. Some have disabled people at home. Some are pensioners who've accepted they might be killed here. We cannot leave them.
Olga left her hometown in the Donbass in 2014 after Russian-backed separatists took over. She later settled in Velyka Novosilk. This is what remains of the house she and her husband worked for 8 years to build. They finished it just days before the full-scale invasion. It has been shelled twice.
I'm sorry. My husband did all the repairs with his own hands. He did everything, every brick. On February 22nd, we laid the floor. On February 22nd, we finished this room. The children's room was already done.
She made this last year with her 8-year-old son.
Oh, it still works. This is how we celebrated the year 2022 as a family in our house. Every time I come back, the scar on my heart deepens. But we are staying strong.
Olga says she believes she'll repair her house and that Ukraine will rebuild. But for that to happen, they need victory on the battlefield. The sooner, the better.
And our correspondent who followed that report, Aya Ibrahim, joins me now in the studio to talk more. Aya, so many Ukrainians have been driven from their homes by the Russian invasion. But despite it all, some have chosen to stay behind. Can you tell us what you found out by speaking to them?
Right, so in that area where we were, both villages are about 10, 15 kilometers away from the front line. Escalation, the village where we started the report, was actually part of the Russian front line until it was liberated by Ukrainian forces in early June. So these are very strategically important villages for both sides. They're filled with Ukrainian artillery positions, and that's why you hear these boom sounds in the background all the time. And because of that, they're also a target of Russian artillery. And as you saw, we had to, kind of exit one of the villages as one hit pretty close to us. So the people that stay there, it's really important to emphasize, are a minority. In Velyka Novosilk, pre-war population of about 10,000, we were told about 200 to 300 people remain. And these are usually old people who really feel that they have nowhere else to go, that whatever is waiting them outside can't possibly be scarier than staying at home. There's also a perception in the larger Ukrainian society that people that choose to stay in these conditions are, quote unquote, just waiting for the Russians to arrive. There's certainly parts of that. Russian propaganda is very strong. There are a lot of Russian speakers in that area, and they get messages like the rest of Ukraine doesn't like you, doesn't like Russian speakers from the Donbass. And so that definitely also plays a role. But I think mostly it's a lot of fear. It's a lot of old people who had in their entire lifetime never set foot out of their village. They'd been through a lot. Neskuchne was incidentally occupied by Russia briefly in 2014, by Russian-backed separatists in 2014. And so it's an area that's been through a lot, and there's really a sense for people, if they've lived their entire lives there, where is there to go? I mean, Olga, the volunteer, that was the only young person that I'd encountered throughout that entire reporting trip. So a lot of fear that really drives that sense of, I need to hold on to what I have. I don't know what's waiting for me, outside.
Yeah, and you really got a sense of the dangers they're facing from your reporting there. Maybe we can talk about the counteroffensive. We know Ukrainian forces are inching forward, taking village by village. Can you tell us how that compares to, say, last year's liberation of Kherson, a major city?
Right. I mean, we remember these iconic images that came out of Kherson in November of last year, soldiers walking into the city, being welcomed with hugs and, enthusiasm by the locals. President Zelensky then visited the area, and there were these sort of, these images that really were turning points in Ukraine's war effort for a lot of Ukrainians. This is very, very different. When Niskuchna was liberated, this was announced in a phone video on social media with two soldiers carrying one Ukrainian flag and saying, well, we've taken this village back. And there, as we saw, absolutely nothing left. And in Niskuchna specifically, there are no civilians left. And that's because Russian troops really have had time to entrench themselves. They've heavily mined areas that Ukrainian troops would need to cross to be able to regain territory. I mean, the soldier that we spoke to, Ivan, at the beginning of the report, stepped on a mine 2 days after we spoke to him. And
oh, gosh.
Last I heard, they were battling to save his legs. And Ukrainians are just not really willing to, take these casualties. That's why it's going slower.
Well, thank you so much again for your reporting and for joining us here in the studio to talk us through it. That is DW's Special Correspondent Aya Ibrahim.
Let's bring in Justin Crump. He's a military veteran and CEO of international intelligence and risk analysis consultancy Sibylline. He joins us from the UK. Mr. Crump, welcome back to DW. Now, a month into the offensive, can we say anything about where it's heading other than, to quote General Mark Milley, that it's going to be long and bloody?
Well, I mean, he's obviously got a pretty good perspective of events, and I think you just heard the people on the front line have a very similar message. And so everyone I've spoken to has said the same thing, which is, people think it's so easy and we could be doing better. They come here and try it. And I think that reflects the real difficulties of operating, particularly in southern Ukraine, where we talked about the very flat, open landscape, the difficulty of maneuvering there, the difficulty posed by drones, lack of control of the air. It's hugely challenging for Ukraine, even before you think about the mines, the artillery threat, and so on. So I think there have been hopes that they could crack open the front, that the Russian defenses would be weaker than maybe they appeared. And I think there's elements of truth in that, but it is a grind to get to the point where maybe Ukraine can start to gain more and more advantage. And in that regard, we've been here before. We saw this west of the Dnieper when they retook that area of Kherson last year, using similar tactics. That was about 30 days of grind. Now, this is on a totally different scale where we are now, but it's not over for sure. And I think the expectations were high. I think Ukraine is getting results. And while a village or two may not seem to matter, the Russian progress was slow. And as you've just seen, these are people's homes, these are people's houses, these are people's livelihood. And it might only be a moral victory to bring them back to the Ukrainian side of the line. But you see how important it is to the Ukrainians, their families, and to the soldiers.
Yeah, the difficulties are great, and a lot of hopes were pinned on the mechanized units, especially those with Western-supplied armor. Is the Ukrainian military able to deploy those as intended?
Well, yes. I think not necessarily perhaps as hoped. We've seen that challenging environment, is difficult to deploy what we call combined arms maneuver, so using these forces together. And the way of which, of course, the UK, the US, Germany, NATO allies in general can deliver that sort of capability took decades to build up. That's a lot of experience went into being able to make this look easy, as the US did in Iraq and the UK, and on those sorts of occasions. So it is a reminder that this is hard. It really is. So expecting a repeat of maybe what we saw in the Gulf and things like that is always unrealistic if you look at the way that forces are balanced in Ukraine and the territory and so on. But the reality is that Ukraine has 10 brigades worth of more modern equipment that has not been committed to this fight yet. I think if it was sort of over, if it was really peaking for Ukraine, those elements would also have been committed. They're not being committed. And as we've said before, when you and I have spoken, the longer those units are not in the fight, the longer they have to train, the longer they have to think about how they can operate in this very, very difficult environment. and actually make progress. So I think the indicator is when they're actually deployed. For now, they're not, and that shows that Ukraine's nowhere near the end of exhausting its potential here.
The delivery of cluster munitions by the United States was partly explained by a lack of other artillery munition. But to what extent does it also reflect the kind of battle this has become? Maybe one that is not trying to outmaneuver the Russians, but turning this into more of a war, of a strategy of attrition on the side of the Ukrainians as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what it's been for a long time. And again, Ukraine's used that strategy before, used it outside Kyiv. They used it outside Kherson before. So, yes, that is absolutely what they're doing. And the cluster munitions, yes, it makes up to some of the lack of supply or a potential way of augmenting the supply that's available for the Ukrainians. We know they'd like to fire a lot more rounds than they are. They are probably at the moment, from what we're seeing, outweighing the Russian artillery in effectiveness, if not in absolute numbers. And they've been going after the Russian guns for a number of weeks now, and you can kind of really see the trend changing, whether or not you believe the numbers underneath, as Ukraine sort of starting to shift the balance in that. So that's very significant. And cluster munitions are significantly more effective against certain sorts of targets, around 10 times more effective than conventional munitions would be by comparison. So they do have the ability to cause more destruction, particularly against trench lines and things like that, where they scatter over a wider area. They're more likely to land where you need them if you're attacking an area target, or indeed guns. Again, you're hitting an area, it's going to do a lot more damage. So it's partly necessity, it's partly tactically useful for Ukraine. And to be honest, both sides have already been using these sorts of munitions. It's not breached anything that either Russia or Ukraine wasn't doing previously. And these battlefields are so littered with unexploded ordnance that although these do pose a hazard, and hence the question marks about using them, I think in this situation with Ukraine fighting for survival, it's not really adding significantly to the risk for the Ukrainians and offers them a considerable advantage.
There are now also reports that the U.S. might be moving towards applying more longer-range artillery missiles, specifically ATACMS. Would those help break through Russia's defense lines and give the counteroffensive a push?
You know, this is that strategic targeting. So again, there's two ways of stopping the enemy artillery from working, one of which is to find it and destroy it, you know, kill the crews, destroy the guns, disable them. And the other way is to make sure they have no ammunition to fire, at which point they're just targets, they're useless. So Ukraine's been doing both, and we've seen the effects of these strikes behind the lines. ATACMS gives them the ability to extend the range of those attacks with more lethality and more distance. So into areas in Crimea where currently the Ukrainians using drones, they're using sort of unconventional techniques to try and deliver attacks well behind Russian lines, having longer range missiles, and we've seen it with Storm Shadow and potentially Scalp, the French variant of the Storm Shadow missile, really opens up a lot more targets, and not just artillery, logistics, supplies, but also headquarters. And of course, Russia has lost a lot of senior officers to strikes on headquarters and other attacks. And again, that's not a sign that your war is going well if you're losing your generals at a fairly steady rate who are getting killed on the battlefield. That's really not what should be happening to your generals. So this all increases the challenge for Russia in defending against what Ukraine's doing. But there are no silver bullets. You know, none of these donations are going to be the thing that wins the war for Ukraine. Yeah. It's how all of that's used together incrementally.
The attack on the Kerch Bridge on Monday and today's explosion in Crimea, both things that you briefly touched on there, are these more morale boosters for Ukraine than significant military successes?
Well, we shouldn't discount the importance of morale boosts for continuing to support and maintaining the will of your forces to fight and the will of your society to support them. But they are more than that. I mean, strikes at the Kerch Bridge are very much at the heart of Russian pride. You see that in how they've reacted by ending the grain deal, by targeting the grain facilities in Odesa, which are hardly really a military target in response, as opposed to the bridge, which actually is being used to directly resupply Russian soldiers. I mean, it's been attacked before. There have been several other attempted attacks on it. And it's a persistent target for Ukraine because it makes life a lot more difficult if it's totally lost, particularly the rail bridge, which currently has not been. But if that's interdicted, that makes life a lot harder for the Russians in southern Ukraine. It's a huge objective. It's a massive choke point for Russia, particularly the railway. And of course, they've attacked the lines themselves. They've attacked the bridges from Crimea to the mainland in the north and those access routes. So the Kerch Bridge is really the sort of golden target in that regard. And again, it is a symbol both ways. I mean, the panic caused to Russians, particularly Russian tourists who are still going to Crimea because they've been told it's safe and finding out, of course, it's not. That in itself, I think, just underscores how important this is, even if that is just a moral factor, as well as militarily. This attack has not yet had the significance, but destroying the rail bridge definitely would.
Justin Crump of Sippeline, always great speaking to you. Thank you for your time.